Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Good.
Sort of that mid to late July appreciation of summer.
Yeah.
Well, feeling like it's in academic terms or like in the cycles of thing terms, like, oh my god, it's gonna be over real soon.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So, what are you doing these days? What's your?
I'm sorry?
What are you doing? What have you been doing this week?
Also, is the noise here okay? Because there's sort of a noise in the background.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
This week was a very interesting week for me. Not a lot of like oral things have like happened in a direct sense. Like the meetings that I usually have still didn't happen yet, as we know. One of them was sort of taken over by a neuromatch mentoring session, which is very interesting and unexpected, and a little bit disorganized, but it worked out. It worked out pretty well, and it made an interesting context from that. Doing a lot of this is sort of an overview. This isn't necessarily updates, but just like a super broad overview of things. Really happy with Joe Pro stuff because it's finally like even in the initial sense of it's just that the kind of work that even like I'm doing something to the website, and it won't, like, to everybody else it will be like, oh well, this looks, nothing's changing here, but sometimes it's about building sort of like the infrastructure so that way things can happen later that you want to do. And I feel like the corner's being turned there a little bit, and that's a relief. The biggest thing this week that I didn't like, my biggest disappointment this week is I really didn't get to sit down and do any writing this week. Like, this week is a complete writing, no movement week, and I'm trying to be pretty ambitious in the things that I'm trying to write or finish writing. And I've gotten most things to sort of like final draft or second to final draft. The inclusive gaming conference post is ever on my mind, and that's ready to go. I'm just actually a lot of it has been not even that part of the writing, but was sort of I had to update Joe Pro stuff. I had to update my own website. I had to update like all the the web, the really unpleasant web infrastructure that is so much more convenient to outsource, and you want to do it, but sometimes you can't. That's what it's been a lot of, and this week is a little bit slower in general for a variety of reasons. But like, progress has been made there, and it's it feels good to do that, even if it's like I don't have anything fun, obviously, to show. But that's basically the vibe. That's the vibe of this week. Speaking from Saturday, there's more to say about the neuromat session. There's more to say about I didn't do anything with them, but I asked if Morgan shows up. I asked Morgan about something about Neurotech X. Nothing. I'm mostly just curious about some of the Boston stuff. I might try to do a few things there or ask about it. These are just, it's been really interesting to continue to meet, not meet, but to, I don't know, like my sense for the whole is really interesting to meet as a segue into some of the neuromed stuff. It's really interesting to meet someone who had a very sober but not apathetic, which I think is like a very special mix. But a sober but not apathetic take on like academia and just specifically Boston,
Yeah.
and what Boston is in that sense in terms of academia, in terms of building things out and doing things and getting having the startup culture of Boston and it's what it does and doesn't do and all this stuff. So that was very interesting, and I'm kind of continuously reflecting on my time here in that sense. Even with a sense that I might not always be in Boston. But yeah, like as I said earlier too, it's like it feels like July is basically over and August is almost over. That's how it feels to me internally.
Yeah.
In terms of like courses, I know when my courses start, my graduate courses start, but things here are going to be starting soon. Like students are kind of the students in Boston will be returning. The things that are like the activities around the schools will be picking up again.
Yeah.
The seasons are it's it's in one sense it's midsummer, and in another sense it's just not. Let's see. The last broad thing is I'm not going to make the announcement yet, but something really nice happened to someone who's been in like the society ethics tech space. I put it in that channel and some other things, but I'm looking forward to like when they can announce it, but it's something that is well deserved. So yeah, that's as much as I'll say for now. But that came through this week as well, so I'm happy for and I guess an alumni is a fair way to say it.
Okay.
Or a member of that the society ethics tech group, and it's always fun to see like like that sort of what to have a moment of like savoring and nice thoughts specifically. I very much appreciate you in the lab creating spaces for a lot of things to happen, and even creating spaces for me or the people to kind of also create spaces.
Yeah.
And like that, like giving it that room to do that, and seeing the trickle down effect for that. And I'm not the reason this big thing happened, but it's sort of you get a little bit of sense of like people pushing in the same direction, and it's very cool to experience that. And I think a lot of people don't even get. I think many people don't get to experience that in like a direct way at all, no less an indirect way. So I mean, just I'm kind of being super vague, but just passing along general good vibes and appreciation for all the stuff that the lab and anything I did was a small part in what happened. Um, but kudos to those who maintain spaces so other people can like explore and have future successes is a great thing. And so and once again appreciate your efforts to that, because it's been a major part of my life too. So good cheers and celebrations to all for that. There's much rejoicing for that. So
Yeah, that's great. And I saw that in the Slack, and I don't know what that's in reference to, but we'll find out, I guess, eventually. So
yeah,
that's good.
I want to. I'm not sure if they want to be the announcers. So I'm kind of waiting for permission for that, but I'm excited. So yeah,
Yeah.
good stuff. How about you? How have you been this
Uh,
week?
well, it's summer, so we're kind of, not as busy as we usually are. I did Monday. We did the Diva War meeting, and so
Mhm.
that was good. We had some updates there, and we had, you check that out on YouTube. We also, I had the mentorship sessions for NeuroMatch. Talk about that in a minute. And those were interesting and productive. Met one person who was really interested in what the lab was doing in terms of Gibsonian information and allostasis
Mm.
machines. So, um, and we had to not do the cybernetics reading group because my mentorship sessions were right at the same time, so I couldn't do that. So, um, yeah, so we're looking forward to some cool things coming out. There's a paper be coming out in Biosystems pretty shortly, um, and this is I'll announce it when it's out. So that's good. And other things that are kind of coming across, how you prepare papers and then you have to get you have to get everything in order. You have to get um, everything edited and ready to go. So we got some things coming up. So Jesse says one thing to talk about later: drawing good diagrams for models of theory, and at what level to tailor RE audience.
I, I'm looking forward to what you were saying. There's an airplane here or something.
Yeah, I heard.
Um, and looking forward to the paper and exactly what you said. And in the process of thinking about this stuff, it reminded me of something that did actually happen this week. It was a small meeting, like I said, like mental health working group. Uh, that was a very light discussion, and it was about that. So we that can be, I think that could be like a fun, uh, deeper dive conversation. But we were looking at making like a super simple like a primer blog post, if you will, about something, and had a nice discussion about that topic. So maybe we'll come back to that later. But it wasn't really like a. It was more of a discussion than like a meeting. So it wasn't. It was a very light week for me too. But yeah, like I look forward to seeing the paper and yes to that process of getting things ready and
Yeah,
making choices about things like diagrams and why or why not. So yeah.
yeah. So okay, so I have a couple things to share. The first thing is that Jesse and I are both doing professional development for NeuroMatch. So this is something Jesse posted in the Slack. It was a image from like a meeting that he went to. I didn't go to this meeting, but this is for the professional development mentorship sessions. So the way they're doing this is they're assigning summer school participants to these sessions, and you get like an hour time slot, and you end up talking to people about different things. So I was in the Neuro AI group here, number 24, and there were people here in, I guess, in computational neuroscience as well. And so I had some good conversations there with people about research, how to do research, how to get into grad school, and also some of the work that we've been doing on Gibsonian information and allostasis machines. Although we're going to follow up on that in a little bit more detail later. And so I sent some papers out to that effect. So that's always good, making those kind of connections with people, giving them advice on things. Um, and so the other thing I wanted to share is this. This is by Paola, and she posted this on the 9th. So it was about 2 weeks ago. So Zura, who's also involved in the lab, um, he's he's working with Paola on this data science thing that she presented several weeks ago. And so her message here is greetings channel. Together with Zura of this lab and a couple other peers not yet part of Orthogonal, and putting together a funding proposal for an NSF call called POSE, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, requiring affiliation with a U.S. research organization. The current team member, which has a U.S.-based institutional affiliation, does not qualify to put forward the funding proposal because they are not full-time. The proposal consists roughly of a project presented here a few weeks ago, which is the thing that Paula presented on. It was the brain imaging, or the Allen Institute data set that she had. So this was actually brain genetics and things like that. If anyone's interested in this work, kindly get in touch to discuss. The deadline for the proposal submission is September, and what we have so far is a concept note, and have given a couple of talks and papers. Okay, so yeah, then this was in the the May 11th meeting that we had, and so this is at about 33 minutes, I guess. So yeah, check that out if you're interested in finding out more, or contact Paula or Zura. And so what she mentions here is this POSE grant, or Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems. So this is an NSF grant that, they always have the NSF grant number here. So if you're interested in different types of grants, you go by the number. And they have all sorts of grants for education, for peer research, for applied research, small business grants, although that's not really through the NSF. And then stuff like this for enabling open source ecosystems. There's another grant that we talked about with respect to open source education that is, I think, part of kind of the same program. But anyways, so this is a grant that supports the facilitation, creation, and growth of open source ecosystems for the creation of new technology solutions. So this is, I don't know whether, I haven't read their proposal or their overview, but this is basically the idea. The Pathway to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or POSE, aims to harness the power of open source development for the creation of new technology solutions to problems of national and societal importance. So it means that, you want to have this sort of maybe pipeline or architecture that is, I guess, open source, that allows you to build on these kind of problems. Many NSF-funded projects result in publicly accessible, modifiable, and distributable open source products, including software, hardware, models, specs, programming languages, or data platforms that catalyze further innovation. So, this sounds more like you want to actually create software or hardware. This is, and so I'm not really sure what the scope is. Like, if it's just like, if you're going to create a set of analyses, or if you're going to, if you already have kind of an existing software platform that you want to improve, or, a set of models and specs that you want to improve. I guess in this case, we'd be more interested in the models and the specifications part of this, or a data platform, although the data platforms are usually things that distribute open source data, kind of like tools, web tools, or pieces of software that do the analysis, or APIs or something like that. So I'm not really sure how they're pitching this, but this is kind of the way these NSF grants are written. It's always hard to get the scale right because how much do you have to propose, and how much are they looking for in a certain chunk of proposal. So, like, for example, if I propose something very trivial that might take 6 months to complete, this might not be the right grant for that. I don't know exactly what the length of the grant is, the award, etc. So these things are to be determined, but I just wanted to go over kind of what they're looking for, and kind of, the idea here, the general idea. So yeah, there's a translational component here, which is where, they have, of course, their innovation, NSF Innovation Core, Partnership for Innovation, and the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer programs. So this is again where NSF is sort of sponsoring not only grants for open source stuff, but also for translational stuff and small business spin-offs, so things that come out of research. And so that's where they're kind of going with this. And there's this link between translational stuff and open source. So that might be a good way to think about these kinds of things. This is due September 5th. I think there's a rolling deadline annually. So you would have the first Thursday in September every year, and that's when it would have to be in. So it's hard to kind of get a grant together, but what happens typically is people will write a grant, they'll kind of prepare it, and then maybe reuse it in different for different grant calls. So this looks interesting. I don't know if this is something we could do, but it's interesting to think about how that might shape some activity going forward. What are people really interested in? Because usually if they want to fund something, that means there's a need for it somewhere. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. So it would definitely could be used to shape some of the activities that they want to do around open data and open source. This is another thing that came up in the Slack, another grant, and I don't know who posted this. It could have been Jesse or Morgan, but this is from the Future of Life Institute. And so this isn't the NSF, this is a private foundation. And you were going to say something, Jesse?
Oh, yeah, just it looks like a really cool grant. And I think I say somewhere in the Slack, like, oh, like I wish. I don't think Joe Pro's ever gonna be able to do this, but it was a sense of, because I'm doing so much with Joe, we're like, oh yeah, I'd love to have organization that could just take up legitimate or put out legitimate submissions to a grant like this, because it's cool to see such a tailored one. Like I think like that's I was laughing when I saw the grant because it's like how to mitigate AI-driven power concentration.
Yeah.
It feels a bit like to me like, here's a grant on why don't you figure out how to save the world and figure out all of society's like combined technological problems. I was like, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
But no, it's a cool. It's a very interesting grant, and I would love to do more with it. I don't know if I can, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is another thing that you think about when you in our society ethics and tech space. What are people kind of interested in, and then just in terms of questions or things that might lead to fundable stuff or something that people will kind of take in as as an applied aspect. So this is how to mitigate AI-driven power concentration. We're offering up to $4 million to support projects that work to mitigate the dangers of AI-driven power concentration and move towards a better world of meaningful human agency. And so this is just kind of this Future of Life Institute, which is the FLI here. They're launching these new grants. Their position on power concentration. So power concentration is just like if I had my hands on AI and I started to amass power, like any technology would allow me to amass power. If I control maybe certain aspects of the technology or certain aspects of data sets or whatever, then you end up with this concentration of power in a very few hands. So that's what they're trying to figure out how to mitigate. So, they think about we risk governments tyrannizing with Orwellian surveillance, corporate monopolies crushing economic freedom, and rampant decision automation subverting meaningful individual agency. So those are the kind of things they're interested in. So I mean, I don't know like what the proposal would be for sort of mitigating some of these things are. I mean, they would have to be social interventions, I imagine, or technological interventions. Although it really would have to, I think, be at the level of both policy and technological design. But anyways, that's the idea that they want to have people thinking about this. And again, for $4 million, this is something that would have to be somewhat significant in terms of its scope and its the resources brought to it. Power here could mean several things. It could mean the ownership of a decisive proportion of the world's financial, labor, material resources, or at least the ability to exploit them. It could be control of public attention, media narratives, or algorithms that decide what information we receive. It could simply be a firm grip on political authority. Historically, power has entailed some combination of all three. A world where the transformative capabilities of AI are rolled out unfairly or unwisely will likely see most, if not all, power centers seized, clustered, or kept in even fewer hands. And so, there's just, I guess, a lot of topics around this truth decay, which is a term where you have this decay in truthful sources of information, power surpassing elected governments, stifling monopolies, Orwellian levels of surveillance and societal control, social media discourse manipulation, and the like. So this is really kind of one of these. So I guess when I said they offer up to $4 million in support, I think it's the entire amount that they're willing to disperse for this. An individual project might be, a small chunk of that, but I think the idea is you have to find something that's worth funding, right? I mean, you could write a paper on it, and that would be fine, but you don't really need funding for that, technically. So it would have to have some set of infrastructure along with it. And I don't know what that would look like. So what world would we prefer to see? We need to kind of reimagine our institutions and incentive structures and technology development. Open source of AI models is sometimes hailed as a panacea. The truth is more nuanced. Today's leading technology companies have grown and aggregated massive amounts of power, even before generative AI. Further, the benefits of open efforts often still favor entities with the most resources. So, open source means like if you fork something and you're a bigger entity, you can do more with it than a smaller entity. Or if you're you create the open source project, the forks, because of their nature, can probably do less with it than the organization, the sort of the source organization itself. So that's kind of the idea here. Open source may be a tool for making some companies less dependent upon others, but it is an insufficient tool to mitigate the continued concentration of power meaningfully to put power in the hands of the general populace. So this is the topical foci here. So one thing is public AI, in which AI is developed and deployed outside of the standard corporate mode with greater public control and accountability. And they're looking for solutions as to how it could work, evaluating different approaches and specifications for a particular public AI system. There's also AI assistance loyal to individuals as a counterweight to corporate power. Safe decentralization, or how to decentralize governance of AI systems and still prevent proliferation of high-risk systems. And again, you propose these things and like there are always these counterexamples or things that it could lead to that are not intended. So, if we decentralize governance of AI systems, that can introduce other problems. So we have to kind of have a handle on all of the consequences of doing these sorts of interventions, as well as the power of these interventions as well. So it's a tough thing to kind of, and I guess that's why they're giving out the money. They want to incentivize people to really kind of build something that's, well thought out. Effectiveness of open source. When is open source mitigated versus increased power concentration? This is an interesting question with respect to some of the things we do with open source sustainability. And that might be something to come back to, but I just wanted to mention it here. Responsible and safe open release. So, when you have an open release, are there safety concerns associated with that? Income redistribution. incentive design, um, the infrastructure, resources, and knowledge needed to convert AI insights into products that meet true human needs, alignment of economic, sociocultural, and governance forces, preference aggregation, which are new mechanisms for discerning public preferences on social issues beyond traditional democratic models, legal remedies, then this Meta, which is not the company, but projects that address the issue of scaling small pilot projects to break through and achieve impact. That's interesting, where you kind of build a pilot project and you say, okay, I want to get funding for that. Now it's kind of scale up from there. Or you have a small pilot project and you want to scale it up, which I think maybe they call it meta because it's kind of not in any of these categories. It's all across the categories. Then the other meta is mechanisms to incentivize adoption of decentralized tools to achieve a societally significant critical mass. Actually, they give examples of things that would probably not make compelling proposals. So this is like the things that they don't think are worth funding. Projects that are implicitly or explicitly dismissive of the rapid and real growth in AI capability, or the need for advanced AI systems to be safe, or technical and scientific realities, such as vulnerabilities of AI systems to jailbreak or guardrail removal. So I guess, like, these are things that you have to take into account. I don't know. I guess, if you don't take those into account explicitly, or if you imply that they're not a problem, then, they're not interested. Projects that simply double down on existing anti-concentration mechanisms or processes, rather than innovating approaches addressing the issues created by AI in particular. And I'm not sure what that means. I guess that, don't take things off the shelf and say, well, we can use this for AI, and maybe that's actually something we can do, but that's not what they're interested in here. Projects that equate democratization with just making particular AI capabilities widely available. Again, taking things off the shelf and saying that they apply to AI. I think they want people to think outside the box, is the point. Projects likely to transfer power to AI systems themselves rather than people, even if decentralized. So you don't want things going from AI system to AI system. You don't want to use an AI system, for example, to mitigate the effects of AI systems. They want a social component, I guess. Projects that aren't focused on AI either as a driver of the problem or of the solutions. So they really want to do, they want people to think about this in terms of the social impacts, have a role for AI, and then think about like the problems specific to AI. So they usually don't provide these kind of direct, directions that are not compelling in a grant call, like we saw with the NSF call. They don't really tell you what's not compelling, and this is actually useful because it really does frame like how you approach the problem. So I like this where you just kind of tell people, okay, this isn't really what we're looking for. We're looking for something that is, more focused on certain things. So this is, they're really kind of looking for people to create a specific tool to be scaled up at a later date, coordinate a group of actors to tackle a set problem, technical research reports on new systems. So that means what's the work product that you want to produce for the amount of money they're giving you. Policy research, general operating support for existing organizations doing work in this space, and then funding for specific new initiatives or even new organizations. So these are all like maybe infrastructural things, or they're, basically creating policy, maybe creating technologies, and maybe, kind of thinking about how to organize that socially. What kind of institutions do we need for this? What does that look like? And how do we scale that up? And so, yeah, this is kind of the deadline for the first round of proposals is July 30th, so that's probably not something that's doable now. But they're, I imagine they'll do this again and again annually. So yeah, it's a interesting set of things, in terms of grants. We haven't talked about grants in a long time. I'm glad that people have been posting on this, kind of thinking about that. Now we can't really go for a grant in the organization here for reasons that we don't have the status that we need. But we can do this through other mechanisms if we need to. And for something like a private organization, I think we can probably do maybe something like that. But it's not clear to me how, how we would, what kinds of organization we need to be to manage that. So, yeah. But any comments or questions, especially about the second one? I know Jesse's, especially with respect to society, ethics, and tech, that might be something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the topic is like super relevant to everything, but at the same time, it sort of feels a little aspirational in the sense of, well, not, it is, but like for myself I think a goal of mine would be one day to, I don't know if it would be make my own organization that could receive that. And I don't know if I'm ever going to be getting like $1 million grants for my own stuff specifically, but I'm definitely interested in learning how to deal with that. Like that's sort of a, I think it's even what I sort of asked Morgan, who's I think you're now. I'm interested in getting more experience in that space just because I find it to be I find I don't there's this whole I don't really know what to call it. And I don't know that it has like I think maybe the closest thing to it would be sort of grant writing is a term that comes to mind. But and I know like doing the like tenure track, like a big part of everything is like securing grants. Like that's I have a colleague who a couple months ago was like, oh, I have a major R1 deadline or R01, I forget what it's called, to get like some major funding for like 5 years or something like that. And like I get that process of like asking for funds from a university or like the NSF and things like that. But I I feel like I don't know. There's a whole and it's weird because I'm kind of I think I feel like I'm on the perimeters of it, both academic, like in terms of straight academia or in the startup and the whole like venture capitaling and angel investors and that whole like more get the startup and get funding and fund your like I think there was some Tony Robbins saying fund your dream or like how to get your moonshot. And it's sort of like this array of um, different processes to get things off the ground and to get the money behind it and do stuff like that. And it's very interesting for me just as a sort of personal share on it. It's like sometimes I wonder about going more intentionally into that space, but then it's sort of this it's sort of like the divide between being a manager of people doing research versus doing the research, or like are you leading people to apply their like is it like in the software development sense like a lot of they come like the I guess it's the common thing, but like the when you're the developer yourself and you're doing the research on how to develop something, you can become the expert in it, but you're not necessarily having the most leadership about how it's implemented versus when you're doing management or policy or higher level decision making or strategy, you're not dealing with it every day at the minutia level and becoming an expert in certain ways. I think it's kind of that trade off, even at this level of like grants and stuff, because I don't know. I have different feelings about where I want to be in the process, but I also feel like I want to get more literacy of it as a whole overall too, because I think it's sort of it affects the difference between um, is it some things require funding and money to do in certain ways, and some things don't. And we kind of directly and indirectly we're constantly talking about that in the lab. Um, from open source direct, commentary, or to just how things work at a broad level. So it's an interesting topic. I don't have any real conclusions about it, but I appreciate going over it here today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's something that we have to think about, not just from the standpoint of like getting the funding, but like how the kinds of things that people are interested in. Like when you think about frontiers of research, what kinds of things are people really kind of the questions that people are interested in finding out more about? So if you want your research to be relevant, what kinds of things can we at least address in the research to make it, oh, people can recognize that and say, oh yeah, that's a societal need. That might be something where it might be relevant to, applications or things that other people are dealing with. It really does give you that sort of
Yes,
relevance. Yeah.
very much so. And like I think if I had sort of I don't know if I want this to be my main career. I guess this is but to that clarifies my point a little bit. Like in the sense of a version of myself would love to be almost this sort of uh diplomatic um or like fixer comes to mind too, but like someone who can take really good projects that are not like there's the work of making it relevant and using the terms that people care about in whatever the moment is. Like a lot of generic funding right now, especially in Boston spaces, but like in any kind of a tech whatever related space, it's sort of the AI and then the Gen AI. Like, oh, go have the Gen AI. Like, there's just like ridiculous, that's a hype word at a specific level of understanding, especially consumer facing things. That's Gen AI. This I don't even know if they mentioned Gen AI in this degree or not. I forgot. I don't remember. But like, it's a different set of things that this institution is looking for, and a different sort of like the keywords and the coding and the phrasing are different. But like understanding that, um, if I had like an infinite, time and could just develop a different skill set, I would do that because I feel like that's such a that affects so much and very good projects. It's almost like basically being a lawyer. Like you could have someone who didn't do any wrong, but if they can't defend themselves or explain themselves or use the language of the law to justify why, then it doesn't matter. Or if they have a great idea, same thing. Like they won't be savvy enough. Um, it's sort of like that literacy. Like there's a grant writing and funding literacy that just is sort of like you're going to need it. And even then, like it's not guaranteed. It's kind of but that just stands out to me so much, and it's sort of um, it's this weird dynamic too of like you you have to kind of be literate in the system as it exists, even if you want to change the system. Uh, so that's a very common theme in many areas that I'm in. So yeah.
Good. Morgan, hello. I don't know if you're available to talk right now, but welcome to the meeting. We've been talking about different grant proposals that have been put in the Slack. There's an NSF proposal for open source, enabling open source artifacts, and then this AI driven open source related thing that we just talked about. So that's, I think there's a lot there that we can learn. Yeah, good morning. But that's something we can, I guess, save for another time as we go along. So, Jesse, you said that you were interested in this question here. Drawing good diagrams from models of theory. So,
Yes.
yeah, we could talk a little bit about that. What's your idea there?
I wish I could show um like this is the kind of thing that'd be great to if I could share my screen somehow and show. I don't know if I can do it the way because like it's very much a thing where if you've done it, you know exactly what it is, and you don't need to look at anything. But if you're a new person coming to it, which is sort of what I was, the context of me having a discussion with people who aren't familiar with it. So, but I mean, at its core, to speak from people with experience about it, um, it's about just choosing diagrams, like the art of choosing the diagram relative to the audience, relative to the point you're making, and comparing them, and maybe even make like this is even like at a, just a almost like a literature review level, but also like creating a diagram, and the nature of doing that. Sorry, hold on a second here. One second.
Right.
That's too bad. I might have an issue with one of my emails. Um, so I mean, if I let me see if I can pull up a screen to show what I'm talking about a little bit. Yeah, this will kind of work. So in the context of some of the things the mental health working group's looking at. All right, all right. So in the context of this, like we just let's just pull up a super general like just search for IFS or internal family models, and we're talking about how do we explain like if we're making it's a very simple introduction blog post about let's say IFS. That's not what we're doing, but like if you're just explaining it or making like internal materials to explain it to somebody, um, like what do you use and what are the benefits of these different ways of talking about it? Like, I'll do this even to make it better. Like this is a I don't know if you can see this super well on the screen, but
Yeah.
this is this is like a a very nice like it's a nice what's nice about this model like even outside of the words is it it's sort of this choice of representing the relationship to these components. In this case, you have, according to the theory, or one interpretation of this theory, you have these sort of three groups: managers, firefighters, and exiles, and you have core self, which is this other sort of component. And the way that this is made, you kind of see, okay, this component, this component, this component, they're all around this thing in the middle. So there must be some kind of relationship to that. And that's sort of nice. And the words are maybe more for like more textbook or higher level stuff. But one of the things that came up in the discussion was like, what's cool, like compared to this thing, this is a different topic, but here you kind of see all these things around one thing. This is sort of that same um, there's an expression of a relationship. It's like kind of like mind mapping in general, but like there's these components are centered around something else, and that sort of implies a relationship. Here's sort of another take on that. You have this sort of triple yin yang modified type around this thing in the middle, and like this sort of taking away from you get the cover of the book has a similar design for IFS. And I'm just kind of talking about like when you're making a model or evaluating when you're making a visualization is the better way to say it. Um, like all these different ways to convey that. Like here's a different take. Like this the fact that they're overlapping here in this sort of generic Venn diagram kind of conveys something slightly different than this one. It's like, oh, well, there's more intermeshing things here, and so on and so forth. So it was just this conversation that came up this week about who's the audience, at what level, at what level do things need to be specific, and realizing too that when you're choosing a diagram, or when you're choosing to visualize a model or how a theory works, you have to make choices about it. And one of the things we discussed in the group, or had a brief commentary on, I suppose, was I'll go back to this sort of like very conventional one, or this higher level one. Like, you have to make choices, and depending on the goal, like in a paper, ideally you can make something very clear that at least illustrates a point, like especially if you're using a new concept, putting in a paper at the level of like a preprint, um, it is sort of a way to crystallize some of the relationships between the components that you're trying to talk about. And that's sort of towards a very specific audience, towards a literate people, literate in that, you know um, you're speaking to a specific community. Same thing, like if you're writing, uh, whether it's a curriculum for a student at undergraduate, graduate, earlier levels, or an internal document where some people will have some exposure, but you're trying to educate internally. Those are all very different, um, sort of goals, or things to keep in mind when you're conveying information, and they have different kinds of trade-offs for, like, this is really good for kind of presenting some of the framework, and in this case using higher level terminology. But for someone who doesn't have any idea, this might be way too overwhelming for them to do. Like, here's a much more, a different way of talking about it, that's like, um, more personification, or anthropomorphic takes even on these sort of components of the theory. And it's sort of like the art of just getting people aware of essentially opportunity cost, I guess is the word you could use here, but just why or why not something is chosen. And maybe even in certain contexts explaining, especially if you're using an existing theory or an existing model, or visualization of a theory, or visualization of a part of a theory or whatever. Why, like being able to explain why that works, and maybe explaining why, or at least offering, hey, this is really nice and explains this point, but what this visualization in particular doesn't get is XYZ, and kind of just bringing that, getting acclimation to the language around that. That's what the discussion was about. But it's sort of a longer, um, pedagogical, and um, there's different strategies to apply about it, and different. It's kind of like it's the art of of doing this sort of knowledge building, and a little bit of throwback to, I saw the old, there was some stuff in the epistemological directories stuff, or I saw that Slack channel again. So kind of this like, how do you do that? How do you teach it stuff? Um, but yeah, that's sort of what the discussion was about.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting. I have some words about that as well. So the first is that you're trying to take an idea and you're trying to boil it down to, some easy to digest pieces. So as you saw, you take like an idea and you say, what components can we break this down into? Sometimes you want to characterize different archetypes, sometimes categories. So oftentimes I'll take like an idea and I'll summarize it into 4 boxes or 4 quadrants. Those quadrants will have different things going on in them. And that summarizes my idea quite well. And this is a lot of times, this is what we'll do with theory building, which is where we want to sort of take a bunch of data, a bunch of input, and we want to create like a model that describes everything we're going to observe. So we might have, for example, four archetypes that we break our theory down into. And we kind of characterize that into these four quadrants. And we visualize it by putting some descriptor in each quadrant. And then, it's easy for people to follow that diagram and say, okay, this is archetype 1, archetype 2, archetype 3, archetype 4. So that's one way to do that. And you have, you can easily, say, okay, my theory is basically fitting things into these 4 bins, or these 8 bins. And so, what they were doing with the little cartoon people was just putting a face on those archetypes, which is fine. That's great. That's something that, there's also the aspect of, kind of bringing that home to people. Like, what does this archetype represent? Is it like a thing in our type of thing system we're interested in? Or, is it just this abstract concept? We don't really want to make it that abstract in a theory. We want to kind of ground it in the real world, or at least, like if it's a psychological theory, we want to ground it in like cognition or the brain or something that people are doing. If it's a biological theory, we want to ground it into biology. So, a lot of times with like systems biology, we do these analyses, or, sometimes with machine learning as well, we get these outputs that are dimensionality reductions. And, like methods like UMAP or some of these other visualization techniques where we see these pretty pictures where you have all these dots and they kind of form clusters, but they're not really clusters. That's something that's really hard to interpret. So you can use these kind of diagrams to like help with that interpretability and say, this is basically what this visualization represents. And then have a diagram where you have archetypes, or maybe, you kind of augment the analysis somewhat. And I've done that in papers where, you're kind of trying to explain an idea based on some, output of data. So we have our data, we have our output. This is what our output should look like. This is how you would interpret that output. Another thing, about theory, more specific to theory building, is doing those kind of graphs. Drawing a graph, maybe like a bivariate graph, and then explaining like what does the bivariate graph represent. So what does a typical bivariate graph look like in this theory, or like an outcome of this theory? And what should it look like? What is the pattern we want to see? So like in some theory, you might predict that like 2 of your variables might be related. There's an independent variable and a dependent variable. And then there's some relationship that you seek in this theory. Like you said, there's a linear relationship between X and Y. We predict that X and Y can be derived from the data that we want to collect. Or, if we create variables based on what we're trying to do, we're trying to get a measurement. So we go and we get that measurement in various ways. We can create these X and Y variables, and then we can plot them out, and we get this linear relationship, or this, logarithmic relationship, or whatever. So ideally, that's kind of like where you think about your theory. You think about the quantitative consequences of that theory. So, like, what is the consequence of that theory in terms of the, what the pattern is that you want to predict. So, you have these graphical representations, which are kind of conceptual. We have these graphical representations, which are based more on like quantitative data or predicted relationships. And then there's this thing that there's a systems biologist by the name of Rob Thomas, and he's at Caltech. And he's given presentations on this idea of figure 7. So like in a standard science paper, in a biology paper, you typically, start out with figure 1, which is maybe like a very vague description of the problem. And that's like one of these diagrams where you just basically, maybe break things into archetypes, where you introduce your problem, maybe the methods you're using, and you visualize all that out. So like this is where you're just stating what you're doing, you're stating your problem, you're doing something that's very general, at a very general level. And then you go through your paper and you have figure 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and those are usually all data related. So in this case, we're talking about a paper where you're collecting data, analyzing the data, putting out figures that, maybe explore different hypotheses or explore different relationships or whatever. So those are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, usually. You can have more, but the idea being that a standard scientific paper of a standard length is going to have maybe, 5 figures that are based on the data. And then it leaves us with figure 7. And so figure 7 is basically taking figure 1 and then thinking about figures 2 through 6 and then kind of merging those together. So it's like, you start out with this very vague idea of what you're doing, what you want to do. 2 through 6 is the data, and then 7 is like the summary of what the data mean in the context of your idea. And so figure 7 should be this elaborate sort of overview of bringing it all home. I like that model because it's very straightforward in terms of how to outline a paper, how to outline a document even, where you can say, okay, we're going to start very generally. We're going to give people a basic idea of what we want to do. We want to go through and break this down into certain relationships, key relationships. And it doesn't have to be hypothesis testing per se. It can just be like in a theory paper, for example, it could be like a very general sketch of what we might expect from the theory, what the theory is, what it involves. And then, 2 through 6 might be, expected relationships. It could be like what we expect to see in measurements, measurement predictions. It might be just kind of like different, specific parts of the theory that, we might sketch out the theory, say, in more detail. We might take our 4 archetypes and break it down into 16, or we might have the 4 archetypes and might explore each archetype in terms of what they involve. So like what Jesse was showing with the text, that text, is really descriptive, but we can take each one of those bullet points of text and break it down into different pieces. What does it mean? And what do they all involve? Because they probably involve, each of those bullet points involves some visualization itself, and you can just break that down into finer and finer grains of detail. And then finally your figure 7, or whatever the summary figure is, the numbering isn't that important. The idea is that you have this figure 1, you have this last figure, and everything in between should be like kind of breaking it down. And then in that last figure you bring everything together. So that's where the synthesis happens. You can describe that synthesis and, kind of give more insight into what you've just talked about, summarizing it. So that's kind of the way I think about this. And, in terms of theory building, you want to have a lot of diagrams. You want to have a lot of graphical relationships, not necessarily based on data, but to show what those relationships should be. So, in DevoWorm recently, we've been talking a lot about networks and network theory. One of the things you can do in network theory is generate hypothetical graph structures. So a lot of times in network theory, people will generate like random graphs as sort of like your default or your sort of baseline. And then the idea is that you want to maybe come up with a graph topology that isn't random. Maybe it's a small world network, which we talked about in DevoWorm a couple weeks ago. It could be a scale-free network. It could be a regular network structure, all of which deviate from that random graph structure. And so if you're proposing a theory, you might say, okay, my random graph, and I'll give you an example of one, is the sort of the baseline. It's the control condition. And then I have maybe a small world network, and that looks like this. And we can draw a line between the random network and the small world network. And we can explain then, in cases where we expect something to maybe go either evolve from a random network to a small world network or deviate from the random network in a small world fashion, what kinds of things drive that process? Why is it different? And you can draw a diagram and say random network, small world network, some information about why it deviates, and have that in a graphical form so that people can say, oh yeah, okay, well, there's this change that happens or this difference that happens in between, a control condition and an experimental condition that describe, and we can describe why that is, or at least what we expect. So, these aren't like, this isn't like hard and fast explanation. This is like our prediction, what we expect. And then you have this random network and maybe a scale-free network. And the same thing holds true there. You can just say, why is this different? Why should we expect this to be different? And so on. And so you can do all this in these graphs. You could have like a figure 1 where you say we expect the random network to differ from these other types of networks. You could have figures 2 through 6, which are like kind of exploring each of these like things in detail. So you might say there are 2 cases where we expect like a small world network to deviate from a random network. We go through the first case, go through the second case. We build diagrams for each of those cases. And maybe there's some intermediate stuff that we need to cover and visualize. Maybe there's some social process or some biological process that's contributing to this change, or, something that we expect there to be a difference. Why is there a difference? So we do this for each of these cases, and then the final figure, we have this much more elaborate explanation maybe, or this much more elaborate diagram where we kind of go through these differences, we list them out, and then maybe we give some exceptions, maybe we give some examples of bivariate relationships and the like. So that's a nice, neat description of that whole process and building a theory around this set of ideas. The final thing I wanted to point out was that, when you look at a diagram, there's a lot of like visualization techniques that people use, or communication techniques that people use to optimize these things. So, systems biology papers, for example, are notorious for having these really sometimes inscrutable figures where they have like 50 panels, and it's like you have like letters, and they have so many letters they have to like start over with like small letters and primes, and but the idea there is you want to fit all of your information on one figure, and maybe that's not the best way to do it. So there are different there are different strategies for laying out information so that it's easy to follow. And it certainly, you can have a lot of panels in your figure, but making it easy to kind of follow through all of those figure variations is good. So yeah, I mean that's, and so but even when you don't do that, like when you have something like what you were showing with the with the circular diagram and breaking it up into pieces and in quadrants, or parts of the arc of the circle, having that kind of in a neat way, not maybe putting too much text in each space is good, or having more sort of images instead of words is also good. It just really depends on your audience too. If your audience is more like familiar with jargon, you could put jargon on there. Maybe it's not a great idea, but there are a lot of ways you can kind of optimize your graph for different audiences. So that's all I have to say on that. I think that's kind of an overview of like my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always so interesting to me to think about both like this way of like the common ground for all this stuff is like trying to make the way the different components relate to each other accessible. But then it's within the audience and the experience level and the are you who are you talking to and what do they know and like what's the bridging of it, like that's just what constantly is on my mind about that. It's its own sort of it's all I could say is like its own art, and there's some rules and some guidance, and there's clearly better and worse ways to do it. But yeah, it's something I think it's a nice thing to talk about because it's sort of thinking about this is sort of something that changes. It's sort of like you know the difference between hearing a nice piece of music or something on the radio and then realizing what it takes to make it. And I think when you're going to bringing students or learners or people into the realm of like knowledge creation as opposed to just consuming stuff that people have like pre-digested and it's like, okay, remember this because people chose it and it's the right way to do it, as opposed to like getting them into the thinking about it. And then I think that's really key. um it's sort of a key part of that process. So it's good to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've been really meaning to put some theory building videos together, and I've not had time to do that. I might actually try to do that because I think there's maybe an interest in that. Certainly, other people have kind of approached this, but there's really a paucity of information out there about like this process, and it's not something that there are books on it, but they're not uh, like it's not a common topic that you have. It's not like learning about different methodologies or even like the philosophy of science. It's very obscure. So
Mm.
yeah, that's maybe more to come on that. So I have some papers to go over. This first one is a paper I think was posted in the Slack. This is a bioRxiv paper. This is called "Problem Solving as a Language: The Computational Lens into Human and Monkey Intelligence." So this is really kind of in the cybernetics paper that we've been working on, we had this set of readings. I think it was from Francois Cholet about what is intelligence. And then we talked about another paper on, defining intelligence, and they really struggled to define intelligence because, as it turns out, it's not very well defined. The typical psychological definitions of intelligence have been sort of, you know, um, we talked about this, where they're kind of based on pre-scientific concepts, where they're not really based on the same kind of, they're not aligned very well. And then, you're applying that to artificial systems. And it's kind of hard to get a handle on what exactly it means to be kind of intelligent, or what parts of, intelligence are really key to looking at something like human-like intelligence and so forth. So this paper is about problem solving as a language, and this is going to involve human and monkey intelligence. I think it's a cross-species study, but it's also this computational lens. So I'm really curious about what this paper is involving. So this is a Chinese group, and someone also from the UK. So that's the group. And then the abstract reads: human intelligence is characterized by a remarkable ability to solve complex problems. So that's our definition of human intelligence, or at least one aspect of it, is where there's this remarkable ability to solve complex problems. Now, it's not really, other species solve complex problems. Chimps solve complex problems, or other species where they're doing all sorts of complex navigation and things like that. But for now, that's kind of the point that they're making here. This involves planning a sequence of actions that leads us from an initial state to a desired goal state. So this statement right here is sort of the basis for sort of modern cognitive science. Modern cognitive science really focuses on sequential learning and sequential knowledge and putting those things into practice and then doing goal-directed stuff. So if you're thinking about memory, models of attention, models of like sensory motor integration, those are all sort of goal-directed things that involve a sequence of actions. So we model that sequence or the sequelae out, and then we get this goal-directed thing. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about this, maybe not in so much of a cognitive science framework, but to sort of think about this as maybe not the case. Like, for example, when we think about intelligence, we think about this very thing, this statement, and we think about solving complex problems. But maybe intelligence is not just about that. Maybe there are other things that it involves. But anyways, that's what they're coming. This is how they're coming at this. Quantifying and comparing problem-solving capabilities across species and finding its, and they say evolutional roots, but it's evolutionary, is a fundamental challenge in cognitive science and is critical for understanding how the brain carries out this intricate process. So again, this is kind of thinking about sort of the evolutionary roots of problem-solving capabilities and kind of, thinking cross-species, but also using a computational model to kind of come at this. So in this study, we introduced the language of problem-solving model, which is the LOPS model, as a novel quantitative framework that investigates the structure of problem-solving behavior through a language model. So they're using a large language model to look at the structure of problem-solving behavior. Okay, that's where we're introducing this as sort of this quantitative framework. Now, of course, with a language model, you have to train it on something, so it can't just be like its own thing. So this is where the cross-species comparison comes in. So we adapted the classic Pac-Man game as a cross-species behavioral paradigm. So this Pac-Man game that they've developed is something that both humans and monkeys can do, I guess. Macaques can participate in. So this is a behavioral paradigm that can test both humans and macaque monkeys. Using the LOPS model, then, we extracted the latent structure or grammar embedded in the agent's gameplay. So this is where we're actually looking at the agent gameplay, and then they extract this latent structure of the grammar. And then this actually reveals a non-Markovian temporal structure. So this is something we're going to talk about in another paper, this non-Markovian model. So a Markovian model is where you have discrete states and there are transitions between states, and there's no memory to this model. So it's a model that has no memory. There's just this transition between states. In a non-Markovian model, you have this temporal structure that's sort of linked to dependence on previous condition. So it's not Markovian in the sense that it's kind of I don't know if you'd call it pseudo-random, but there's no expectation for the previous state. So this is where, it's not Bayesian, it's non-Markovian. So that's kind of the structure that they're looking at of their problem-solving behavior. So basically, problem-solving relies on prior states, on memory, and then that's reflected in the sort of this behavioral states that emerge from that, or the grammar. The LOPS model captures fine-grained individual differences among the players and revealed the striking differences in the complexity and hierarchical organization of problem-solving behavior between humans and monkeys. And so there's this complexity and hierarchical organization of the behavior, and there are differences that exist as we might expect, reflecting the distinct cognitive capabilities of each species. Furthermore, both humans and monkeys evolved their LOPS grammars during learning. So these LOPS grammars are the grammars when you train the model that can find this latent structure of the problem, of the solutions that the macaques and humans are using, and then they generate grammars. So these grammars evolved during learning, progressing from simpler to more complex ones, suggesting that the language of problem solving is not fixed. So this is where we have this language of sort of this grammar of problem solving, and it's not fixed. It actually evolves to support more sophisticated and efficient problem solving. So over the course of learning, and they're using evolved here in two different ways. They say up here that it's like there's these evolutionary roots of problem solving, which means that humans and macaques as primates, they share maybe a common basic substrate for learning. And then, of course, humans and macaques have their own abilities for learning, or own sort of intelligent behavior that is derived from that common ancestry. But then, of course, you have this use of evolved, meaning that when you engage in a task, when you learn the structure of the task, how do you master that structure, and how does that reflect the intelligent behavior that's generated by that? So that's what these two uses of evolved. I wanted to clarify that. But this means that, basically when humans and monkeys are both engaging in this task of playing this game, they generate this kind of model of the game. They generate ways to solve problems in the game, and they generate this grammar that is non-Markovian, that's biasing itself over time as they learn more and more about the game to these more sophisticated and efficient problem-solving abilities. Through the lens of a language model, our study provides insights into how humans and monkeys break down problem-solving into compositional units and navigate complex tasks. So this compositional units aspect is important because, one of the things about AI is that, or AI systems, is that they're, to achieve intelligence, a lot of people say, well, intelligence is compositional, or, acquiring information is compositional. And that basically means that you're composing intelligence out of different things. So you're composing it, say, out of different types, pieces of information that you're acquiring, and then integrating that into a larger model. So you have these, problem solving is broken down to compositional units. So basically, if a monkey sees like the Pac-Man game, they notice that like if you move the Pac-Man away from the ghost, you survive. So they can understand that. Then they understand that you can maximize maybe your score by eating more pellets, or whatever. They're just these different pieces that are sort of learned as you engage in the task, and then they're all put together somehow to master the task. And so that's what they're kind of finding here. And of course, there's a parallel between these compositional units and this grammar. And so the grammar is actually, the sort of putting those compositional units together. This framework deepens our understanding of human intelligence and its evolution, and establishes a foundation for future investigations of the neural mechanisms of problem solving. All right, so yeah, this is very reminiscent of a lot of the cross-species stuff that people do in neuroscience. Those are always fun because it's like you get to see like sort of the commonalities and differences between different species. It's very hard, kind of hard to draw insights from it, other than that they're different, right? So this is something that I think there's like maybe some theory that needs to be done on like cross-species behaviors. I mean, I know we have evolutionary theory, but it's hard to kind of figure out, a lot of times neuroscientists and cognitive scientists don't really talk about it in terms of common ancestry. And, they talk about it in terms of just difference. And it's kind of a little bit hard to gain any insights out of that. But anyways, the paper goes through their model. They use, of course, the classic Pac-Man game as a probe, and they developed this framework, the language of problem-solving model, LOPS model. So the Pac-Man task, of course, is where you have this video game Pac-Man. In this game, players guide Pac-Man in a maze to eat pellets while avoiding and at times hunting ghosts. 2 ghosts are programmed into the game, so this is just the 2-ghost version. If caught by a ghost, players receive a timeout penalty after all characters are reset to their starting locations. So they've modified the original Pac-Man game to make this sort of almost like a reinforcement learning game where you kind of get rewarded for good behaviors and penalized for bad behaviors. So this is, very much behaviorist kind of paradigm. So, if you want to make this sort of a way to sort of like elicit some of these problem solving behaviors, that's probably they're trying to maximize it for that. So we tested humans and monkeys at comparable game settings with one notable difference. The monkeys received real-time juice rewards corresponding to their in-game points, while the humans were shown a real-time cumulative point of the current game tally on their screens. So this is the point I was making before about like noticing like the reward in terms of points. So monkeys don't really understand the concept of points, but they do understand juice rewards. So if they get more juice, it's basically a higher score. So they're kind of normalizing that. Hopefully that helps get a similar result. It sort of normalizes the result. They collected behavioral data from 34 humans and 2 monkeys. So I guess it's harder to work with monkeys than getting human subjects on this. But yeah, so this is a diagram here. This is, of course, our figure 1, as we just mentioned. This is the sort of summary of what you're doing. So we have the initial state where they start playing, the language of problem solving. So this shows that you have this grammar, which of course are these grams. So it's an n-gram model of grammar. So you have the bigrams, trigrams, and unigrams. You have, like these strategies where you have two things, 3 things, and 1 thing grouped together. GLLO would be the bigram, STEN and AP being the trigram, and EV being the unigram. And I guess that relates to different strategies for solving for navigating this and solving the problem of avoiding the ghosts, eating a power pellet, hunting the ghosts. So that's what they're going. And then the actions are sort of mapped from the strategies. So the strategies here map to these different actions, which are moving in different directions. And so you can see here that the trigram, for example, results in these 3 strategies. It's just 3 strategies bundled together. It's an n-gram model. And then the actions are these 6 different possible actions that result from these strategies. Okay, so this is how they're deriving this grammar from these strategies from this kind of task. Just so we're clear, because it isn't immediately obvious how you would apply the Pac-Man game to a grammar. And then this is our Markovian model, or a non-Markovian model. And so you can see that you have upstream, you have these states, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, and S6. And there's a transition from each of those forward. So this is the flow of time forward. You have these different strategies or different words. So you have the bigram, the unigram, and the trigram. And these correspond to the grammar. You have these different strategies, which are the words, the chunks. And then you have this sort of transition matrix where you can go from state S1 to this word GL, and then to this word LO. We're going from word GL back to state 2, S2. You can go from state 1 to state 2 directly if this bigram isn't applicable to the strategy that's being used. There's just a transition from S1 to S2. And you can do that for any one of the states, going from S1 to S2, S2 to S3, and so forth. Or you can transition into these strategies, and you can only maybe use one strategy in this bigram and move it to S2, or use both of them and move to S3. So it's interesting how these grammars are sort of you can use parts of the bigram or trigram, and but they're grouped in this way. So this is the grammar. These are the words, and then this is the Markovian model. So it's a non-Markovian model in the sense that it doesn't operate by the pure state transitions. You interact with these grammars in different ways. So the strategy abbreviations are LO, local, GL, global, EV, evade, ST, stay, AP, approach, EN, energizer, which is eating the pellet. So this is kind of how they define these strategies, and then these are grouped in the according way. So to play the game, the subjects need to create a solution by piecing together a sequence of actions to clear the maze. Okay, that's basically the global state or the goal. And so in achieving that goal, they go through this LOPS model and they kind of make this non-Markovian path through it. And then to achieve this goal, we first need to determine at which level we should build the language model. Although the Pac-Man game is solved by a sequence of actions, which are these arrows, the basic components of the LOPS model shall be at a higher level of abstraction, which means that you don't abstract it at this raw sequence of actions, you abstract it at these other types of actions that were described in the set of words. So, as motor actions depend too much on many details of game states, such as maze types and Pac-Man's exact location, cognitively similar solutions can be associated with a large variety of action sequences, which prevents us from understanding the compositional principles of the player's problem solving. So this is where you can't just use output motor actions directly. You have to kind of think about how those motor actions kind of fit together, are strung together. And so this is also a problem because you get this really you can't understand the compositional principles. You only understand the motor outputs and their sequences. So they had some previous work in 19. We can go down to that in a bit, but this provides a better alternative. In that study, we have demonstrated a set of heuristic strategies that can account for the monkey's behavior in the Pac-Man game. Each strategy focuses on a subset of the game elements and a sub-goal. So they're solving for a sub-goal and then they put those sub-goals together and dictates the joystick action selection accordingly. So for example, the local strategy, which is LO, a player only considers the reward within a 10-tile radius and moves the joystick to guide Pac-Man in the direction that offers the largest reward. So it's a local maximization of reward. While the evade strategy directs Pac-Man away from the nearest ghost, which is more of a global evade. Just, there's no counting. It's just wherever the nearest ghost is, let's get away from it. Importantly, we showed that the monkey's gameplay could be described as sequences of dominating strategies. So this suggests that there's some game theoretic aspect to this too that you could implement, but that's beyond what we're doing here. And so human gameplay can be similarly described as sequences of dominating strategies. In addition, we identify two additional strategies: stay, keeping Pac-Man near a specific location, and save, keeping Pac-Man away from the Energizer. And so this is where you can actually implement different techniques to hunt ghosts more efficiently or to take advantage of scarce resources. So the core of the LOPS framework is this language model term up n-gram. So up n, which is UPN gram, which is based on the n-gram language model. Like in a typical n-gram model, the probability of adopting a strategy depends on its preceding n-1 strategies. In a unigram model, where there's a single word or strategy, each strategy is history independent. So this is where we don't care about the history in unigram, and this would be like purely Markovian, I guess. With a bigram model where n equals 2, which has 2 rules in it, strategies are Markovian, okay, dependent on only the immediately preceding strategy. So when you transition from state 1 to state 2, state 1 to state 2 transition depends on your being in state 1. So that's also Markovian. And then for more complex n-grams where n is greater than 2, strategies are no longer Markovian. So for the trigram, strategies are now no longer Markovian. They exhibit dependencies on multiple preceding strategies. So when you go through your state machine, you have S1 to S2, S2 to S3, S3 to S4. What happened in S1 is relevant to what's going to happen, your probability of reaching S4. And so this is where, we have this non-Markovian model where we're not reliant on the immediately previous state. We're not history independent. We actually have to, it's history dependent. It's path dependent, basically. We also consider a variant, the skipgram, in which strategies can depend on non-consecutive preceding strategies, skipping one or more in between. Long n-grams and skipgrams provide more flexible and efficient decision-making and demand more cognitive capacity. So yeah, this is basically the model that they're using. This shows the LOPS grammars. This is the ratio of n-grams, bigrams, and unigrams. So the n-grams are larger than 2, which are the trigrams. The bigrams are the 2 strategies, and then the unigram is the 1 strategy. So you actually have this interesting thing here where you have expertise and amateur. So you have this expert sort of behavior. You have the amateur sort of behavior. So you have experts clustering up here using more bigrams and n-grams. And then, I guess kind of unigrams as well. It's hard to see kind of how these distribute in this 3-dimensional space. You have experts and amateurs clustering out, in different groups. You have, I guess monkey O is here. And yeah, it's kind of hard to see what they're getting at with this graph. This is kind of an example of one that could be done a little bit better. But this is the n-gram usage ratio up here. Each subject's unigram, bigram, and complex n-gram usage ratio is plotted in 3D space. By applying the agglomerative clustering method to n-gram usage ratios, we do identify 2 distinct clusters among the human subjects, experts and novices. The monkeys are indicated by the yellow, which is monkey O, which is here, and the purple dot, monkey P. I think the purple dot is here. So they're both, it's overlapping with the yellow. So they're both, the monkeys are both in this amateur category, and they match sort of the human amateurs, but they don't match the human experts. So I guess the takeaway here is that the monkeys don't master it like the humans do. And they use, less complex grammars. So the high unigram usage and a moderate bigram usage and a low n-gram usage. I guess that's the lesson to take away from this graph. You also see this here in D, where you have the experts, the distribution of complexity with the experts, and those are all humans. You have the novices in this distribution with a lower mean LOPS complexity, and then the monkey O and monkey P examples, which are really kind of with LOPS complexity very similar to the human novices. And the human experts, of course, are overlapping, but the human experts can exceed what the monkeys can exceed. So let me go down to 17 here, this resource, this reference. Oh, this is the state space. So this shows kind of the strategies and how they transition between strategies. This shows the expert human, where they have many more strategies, and there are different transitions between them. The novice human, which has fewer strategies and there are fewer transitions between them. They're kind of maybe alternating between a few strategies more commonly than others. And then the monkey reflects the novice human, where they kind of transition between only a small number of strategies. And so basically the monkey performance matches the novice human performance. All right, let's go down to the references. So reference 17 is this paper by Nie in 2021, and that's Geometry of Abstract Learned Knowledge in the Hippocampus. It's a Nature paper. So this is interesting that they're bringing up spatial learning in the hippocampus in this, and especially the geometry of abstract knowledge. So I guess in Pac-Man we're using similar things to spatial cognition and kind of understanding the geometry of abstract spaces. So that's really interesting. Okay. So our second paper is on non-Markovian social contagions in cyclical complexes. And so this is in communications physics. This is another group of authors. I guess they're from China. Yeah. And so they talk about these non-Markovian social contagions. So they're talking about networks now. And they're talking about how you can have social contagions in these cyclical complexes, which are where you have shapes that, you have network connectivity that forms simple shapes. So you can have triangles and diamonds and other types of complexes that form, distinct sort of topologies. And then, that's sort of these subnetworks that you can actually characterize. And so this is where we're merging topological data analysis with network theory. So that's what they're getting at. And then they have these non-Markovian social contagions, which they'll describe. So the abstract reads, higher order structures, such as cyclical complexes, are ubiquitous in numerous real-world networks. Empirical evidence reveals that interactions among nodes occur not only through edges, which are the connections between nodes, but also through higher dimensional cyclical structures, such as triangles. So you have two nodes that are connected through an edge, but of course you can have three nodes that are connected by three edges, and those form triangles. And those are higher dimensional structures that we can look at. So in a network, we're often interested in these pairwise relationships between two nodes as sort of the baseline for our building the network. We usually have this ij relationship between the ith node and the jth node. In cyclical structures, we're interested in triangles, where we have the ith, jth, and kth node, and then we connect those in different ways, and we can actually look at those structures as an individual unit. Nevertheless, classic models such as the threshold model fail to capture group interactions with these higher order structures. So when we build a threshold model of edges, and we say that all edges over a certain strength are included in our network, those, we can use those to sort of understand our network and, distinguishing between signal and noise, because there's a lot of noise in these interactions. Now, in the classical model, it fails to capture group interactions within these higher order structures. In this paper, we propose a higher order non-Markovian social contagion model, considering both higher order interactions and the non-Markovian characteristics of real-world spreading processes. So we're looking at these higher order structures. We're also looking at how real-world spreading processes, which is where something spreads from node to node. And of course, when you have those pairwise interactions, we can just simply say that when something spreads from node to node, that it relies on its immediately previous state. So that's Markovian, like we talked about with the strategies. So when we go from the ith node to the jth node, we have this immediate relationship between two states, and that's of course Markovian. But then when we have multiple nodes that have multiple edges, and we consider a spreading process that spreads from node to node to node to node, and we characterize that with one of these cyclical complexes, say like a triangle or a diamond or a triangle or something even larger and more complex, then we have this non-Markovian model, which of course is where, we have to look at the path dependence of this spreading process. We develop a mean field theory to describe its evolutionary dynamics. Simulation results reveal that the theory is capable of predicting the steady state of the model. Our theoretical analysis indicates that there's an equivalence between the higher order non-Markovian and the higher order Markovian social contagions. So there's an equivalence between these two processes, even if it's non-Markovian, and which is probably good for our predictive abilities because, we want to break down this process into its parts. We want to also look at pairwise relationships if we're interested in looking at very specific events in this path dependence. So that's good. Besides, we find that non-Markovian recovery can boost the system resilience to withstand a large-scale infection or a small-scale infection under different conditions. So you can look at different, degrees of infection different scales of spreading, and it's consistent across those. This work deepens our understanding of the behaviors of higher order non-Markovian social contagions in the real world. So, I mean, this is a pretty hard, if you're not used to like how people think about networks and how people think about spreading on networks or contagions, it's maybe a little bit hard to wrap your head around. But they talk a little bit about this in the paper, where they talk about these simplices, where you have nodes and edges that form triangles or some sort of tetrahedron. In the real world, many systems can be effectively represented as complex networks consisting of nodes and edges. So these simplical complexes are frequently observed in these networks as sort of the substructure of the network. For example, a feed-forward loop is a significant network structure in the transcriptional regulation networks that exist that people have extracted from gene expression data. So these feed-forward loops are, very common motifs, what they call motifs. And, motifs are basically these substructures, but they don't really form anything we understand as as a shape. And so, there's this connection between these like substructures and these, shapes that we can like derive from network topology. So we have feed-forward loops. We have also closely connected structures such as triangles, which are commonly found in networks of scientific cooperation and social communication. Simplical complexes can also be identified in diverse domains, including brain networks, email networks, and human contact networks. So we've talked about this before, where you can use complex networks to model a wide variety of systems, and it assumes a sort of universality. So the universality then, of course, allows us to take these structures that we see in the network topology and identify them all across different systems, like in the brain or in technological networks, socio-technical networks, and social networks or pure social networks. And then, of course, spreading dynamics is a very important thing to understand for both social contagions and for diseases. However, empirical evidence reveals that pairwise interactions between nodes cannot capture group interactions in real networks. So we can't just use pairwise interactions to understand these network relationships. We can't really understand the simple parts of that. We have to understand, this phenomena through these sort of simplical complexes. So network scientists have increasingly focused on the impact of these higher order interactions, which is what they're doing here. For example, the higher order interactions of two simplices can lead to a phase transition from continuous to discontinuous social contagion. So, if we think about these pairwise relationships between ith and jth node, we can just piece them together compositionally and say, okay, something spreads from ith to jth node, and then from jth node to kth node, and then so on and so forth. And we can see this very continuous spreading. On the other hand, if we look at this in terms of two simplices, we don't get that same type of regularity. We get these sort of things that have this contingency and can indeed be discontinuous in time. So things can hang around in that simplex and then, spread to another simplex and so forth. In competitive spreading processes involving two types of epidemics, which we can model as sort of, a multi-compartment model where we have a single network and we have two sources, two nodes that are the sources of different epidemics, and then they spread competitively across the network, recruiting nodes as they spread. An increase in the infection probability within higher order structures can result in alternating dominance between the two epidemic types. And so this talks, this is really kind of in reference to evolutionary dynamics, which I won't get into here, but that's relevant to this problem. And so it's like when you have two things that are competing in a space, they sort of compete for resources, and they fluctuate in terms of their dominance. And this is actually what we saw in the other paper, where they talked about dominant strategies. So it's interesting how those two things are related. Furthermore, in temporal higher order networks, the temporal properties of the underlying network structure contain the impact of higher order epidemic spreading. So this is where we have to look at the temporal properties of the network structure and how that constrains the impact of spreading. In multi-layer networks, for example, resource layers or social layers with two simplex structures can effectively suppress epidemic spreading and outbreaks. So this is where if we take our problem and we divide it up into two parallel networks that form two layers, we have a resource layer and a social layer. We can actually, and then divide that up into our simplices, we can effectively model how epidemics get suppressed, how they can spread, or how you can get outbreaks. So as you know from COVID, we can have, not everything becomes an epidemic. Sometimes you have diseases or viruses that are constrained in their spatial distribution or in their social distribution, and sometimes they break out and they spread into an epidemic. Or sometimes you get things that get suppressed, and then occasionally you'll have outbreaks, which then die out and get suppressed again. So you have these complex temporal dynamics that are interesting and something we can model with networks, but we have to know kind of how to model it in using these simplices. Finally, the coupling between signals defined in nodes and edges result in explosive topological synchronization. So this is where we have these explosive processes such as rapid expansion, outbreaks, and suppression, which is, I guess, the inverse of explosive. But the point is that you have these nonlinear dynamics. In classic spreading dynamic models, such as epidemic spreading models, the infection or recovery process is typically assumed to be a Markovian process. In other words, an infection event occurs at constant rate. So we have this rate parameter that we have to worry about, leading to an inter-event time that follows an exponential distribution. So this is where we have like our strategies where you transition from state to state. We assume that the infection or recovery process is Markovian. So when we go from ith to jth node, from jth node to kth node, that's a Markovian process. It's basically linear and it occurs at a constant rate. So the transition from state to state is at a constant rate, and we don't vary that rate very much in terms of time. But then we also have this inter-event time that follows an exponential distribution. So this means that we have these sort of differential dynamics that are interesting. We also have studies that have shown that many real-world processes are non-Markovian, and their inter-event times do not follow an exponential distribution. So the inter-event times vary in non-Markovian versus Markovian processes, and we can look at that statistically. The empirical evidence indicates that inter-event time of infection or recovery events and epidemic spreading processes do not follow an exponential distribution, but a curved distribution with obvious peaks, and that response is this nonlinear aspect that you get from the non-Markovian thing. So in other words, individuals become infected or recovered within a concentrated period of time. In innovation diffusion processes, which is a different set of spreading phenomena, basically where some innovation spreads across the network. So if you think about tool use in monkeys, or you think about computer use in humans, that innovation spreads across the social network. People buy computers, they start learning how to make tools, et cetera, et cetera. There's this diffusion process of those innovations that mimics the sort of spreading of diseases, or this this epidemiological model. So in innovation diffusion processes, the inter-event time for adopting a new product follows a bell-shaped curve distribution, which is a non-Markovian process. The significance of non-Markovian processes has garnered increasing attention, including efforts to comprehend their impact on epidemic spreading thresholds investigating equivalences between non-Markovian and Markovian epidemic spreading processes, examine how non-Markovian recovery processes influence failure propagation, and uncover the conditions under which Markovian and non-Markovian models are transient state equivalent. So there are a whole bunch of things here and a whole bunch of references from 47 to 40 to 52 to 53 to 54 and 56 to 57 and 58. So from 47 to 58, there's references, and we'll check those out in a little bit. Right now, this is kind of their image of this illustration of theory-related concepts. So you have these zero simplex, which is a single node, a one simplex, which is a connection between two nodes, a two simplex, which is a triangle, a three simplex, which is this diamond, and then the simplical complex, which is like a combination of these different simplexes. So in this one, we have a zero simplex connected by a one simplex to a two simplex connected to a three simplex, another one simplex connecting another three simplex. So you have these simplical complexes that you can put together as sort of a subnetwork. They consist of these different simplexes. And then you can look at, how things are, kind of spread within the simplical complex, within these simplexes themselves. And so that results in something that, if our default is the one simplex or the ith and jth case, then we have, more interesting dynamics in these higher order simplexes, but also in the simplical complex. This shows the one simplex infection, so going from one node to another. That's a pure Markovian process. The two simplex, which is this non-Markovian process. And then recovery, which is a Markovian process, or feedback on the one simplex case. We have these virtual nodes, and these are kind of like hypothetical scenarios. And that's kind of why we have these dotted lines in here. But basically, it just shows kind of these different representations. Again, you have in C, you have this non-Markovian infection recovery process in simplical complexes, and just showing that. So that just shows a bunch of theoretical results here. How these different simplical degrees performed, and this has an effect on the steady state infection density. So they're able to derive a mean field theory here, where they can kind of get a sense of what the mean behavior is of this system for these different simplical complexes. So it doesn't describe every case, but the theory is basically one that just describes the mean case. And then so finally we get to the references. So I mentioned that we have a bunch of references here that are related to non-Markovian behaviors. So I think it was 47 through 58. So you have, so 58 is validity of Markovian modeling for transient memory-dependent epidemic dynamics. 57 is non-Markovian recovery, makes complex networks more resilient against large-scale failures. So again, we have these aspects of robustness and, thinking about how memory-dependent the structure is. Non-Markovian epidemic spreading on temporal networks. This is just basically more about like how you get these temporal networks and these spreading events that are non-Markovian. 55 is equivalence and its invalidation between non-Markovian and Markovian spreading dynamics on complex networks. So this just shows you that they're not equivalent. 54 is equivalence between non-Markovian and Markovian dynamics and epidemic spreading. So this is about, I guess these are two kind of papers that go together. 53 is non-Markovian infection spreads dramatically, where spread dramatically alters the susceptible infection susceptible epidemic threshold networks. So again, when you have these thresholds, you have the ith and the jth connection. If it's a weak connection, we don't count it. So in the real world, that would mean that if ith individual and jth individual are interacting, they don't spread whatever it is that's the contagion. If the threshold is higher, if the sort of the virulence of the thing is higher, then ith connection or ith node will spread to jth node. So that's how you can think about these thresholds, and then that works across the network. So each edge has a certain threshold, and that kind of model is sort of what they're arguing is that that's not sufficient to explain some of these dynamics. 52 is mean field models for non-Markovian epidemics on networks. So people have worked on these mean field models before. Generalization of pairwise models to non-Markovian epidemics on networks. So again, taking the pairwise model of networks and making it this non-Markovian aspect. And I guess the innovation of this paper is that they're using simplicial complexes. So people have looked at this non-Markovian spreading before, but this is kind of introducing this topological aspect. 50 is analytically solvable model of spreading dynamics with non-Poissonian processes. So non-Poissonian processes are, of course, related to non-Markovian processes in a number of ways. So I'm not going to get into that now, but that's an interesting paper to understand more about this. 49 is impact of human activity patterns on the dynamics of information diffusion. So this again is having to do with these spreading networks and information diffusion instead of epidemiology. This paper 48, impact of non-Poissonian activity patterns on spreading processes. Again, this is the spreading process and thinking about this in terms of Poisson versus non-Poisson activity. And Poissonian is in reference to like the Poisson distribution or Poisson process, which is where you have this thing that occurs, these different events that occur over time, and they tend not to be normally distributed. They tend to be clustered in a Poisson, according to a Poisson process, which there's an equation for, and you can derive a distribution. And we won't get into what that looks like, but suffice it to say it's different than sort of a random or purely stochastic process. And then 47, of course, is this using Weibull distribution for modeling bimodal diffusion curves. And this is on the product life cycle. So this is having to do with technology, the evolution of technology and the spreading of technology, and thinking about how things diffuse. And of course, you can model diffusion as a bimodal distribution or bimodal process. So there's a lot of stuff here that's connected between, intelligence, cognitive ability, epidemics, and network theory, and then these different types of Markovian and non-Markovian processes.
Yeah, really interesting. I've mentioned this before, but the advanced electromagnetic neuroimaging, which is the dynamic causal modeling. So you're putting this particular Janssen-Rit, 3-cell type model in each node, right?
Yeah.
And then you're potentially trying to explain the differences between two EEG conditions, right? Or two EEG populations.
Yeah.
You got same task, different populations, or different tasks, same population. But just how important the computational modeling is to understand that dynamics, and sort of what's possible, what's not. This is where this kind of computational work just is absolutely necessary. And interesting how just like the addition of nodes isn't necessarily linear or intuitive.
Right.
Yeah. And then when you think about brain connectivity, that you're almost certainly dealing with simplicial complexes.
Yeah. What's interesting is that there's this work being done by Pocky in Devo
Mm. Mm.
on building like these neural developmental programs where you're synthesizing networks and different network topologies. And like one of the things we pointed out, I think 2 weeks ago, is that they, in their package, they assume that there's a small world network being built, which means that you have these nodes that are highly connected. They join a lot of parts of the network, and there's a short path length between different ends of the network.
Yeah.
And so that's just an assumption they make. Now, we don't know if that's how networks should be connected. Certainly, connectomes, like C. elegans connectome, is revealed the small world architecture.
Yeah.
But you could easily connect these networks in different ways and get different results.
Sure.
So,
Sure. Yeah. And sometimes we're making those assumptions so that we can actually compute some solutions. But we know that those assumptions are going in, right?
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Now, is she doing that off of the basis? I mean, when you say synthesizing networks, is that just from? I mean, is that literally just in silico experiments, or is that off of some sort of imaging or cell fate data or something like that?
Well, I think I think what she's maybe starting out with is like synthesizing it in silico, just kind of.
Okay, I mean, just pure simulation.
Yeah, and then I think like you could put in you could have as an input like actual data from the embryo. In this case, it would just be synthesizing networks of cells, not neurons or an emerging connector.
Yeah.
But we also in several years ago we did of course the work with developmental Bradenberg vehicles, and we have this platform where we actually have these growing networks of connectomes in the Bradenberg vehicles, so we can define a network in terms of its size. We can simulate it, so we can grow the network over different simulations and see the differences between the network topologies. So that's in silico in like a Bradenberg vehicle where you have different nodes within the network, in the neural network inside, and it's showing differences in terms of how it's behaving. And so we've been interested in that, and people have done a lot of work on sort of growing neural networks, so growing the size of a neural network. In this case, it's just a multi-layered neural network that's growing in terms of its node size and its depth, and then seeing what that looks like. And that's interesting work too, because it just shows that there's this difference between networks of different size, not only statically, but what happens when you take the same network, train it, and then expand its capacity. What happens there? So that's kind of it's an interesting field, yeah.
No, totally, absolutely. It's just making me think about this project from Roche, looking at inferring and perturbing cell fate regulomes in human cerebral organoids, and I think they're doing, so it's definitely development, but I think it's also trying to get at kind of this would be networks, gene regulatory networks.
Yeah.
And they, I believe, have some good data that they've made available. Interesting thought. I wonder if that would be something. I think that would, maybe Lucas would be interested in something like that. I mean, he keeps asking about genomic kind of projects, but it would be nice to keep it. I keep thinking about psychiatric genomic work, and then I just think it's just such a mess.
Yeah.
What's the what's the analogy that people use? Like so many ships have crashed there, or something like that.
Yeah,
like,
on the shoals of.
It's, didn't they used to say that about a particular scientific field, or like particular? Anyway,
Yeah.
this would be very Devo worm, or related. Like it's organoid, it's cell fate. I mean, I like the cell fate regulomes.
Right.
And I don't know if he's used any. If he's done any R work, but I mean, again, another, if you want to do genomics, then like you should have some R experience.
Right. Yeah. It's hard one. Yes.
That would be bad. That wouldn't be bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So, is this something that is shared in brain organoids? I feel like it was.
I might have, but this is the awful thing about not having that Slack history. I might have shared it 2 years ago.
Well, I remember seeing it when you mentioned it.
It was a really cool. It was a really great. Some of the groups that I've met, or some of the kind of like molecular startup people that I've met here in San Francisco, I've pushed them towards something like that paper, in terms of just like here's a molecular paper with actual it's very very related to kind of actionable these are kind of mechanistic insights that could be useful for them, right? Anyway, I'll put it. It's easy to find. I mean, I already found the paper. I just not enough groups use the term regulome.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, people use a lot of buzzwords, but
but it's a good one, right? I mean, especially in terms of development, and that we understand. Again, like your genome is not your destiny,
right?
In the sense that what we need to know is which genes are on when,
right?
And that I don't know whether that means that we go full Dennis Noble, but that kind of the regulation of the genome is what the expression of the genome in time is what we actually is your destiny,
right? Yeah.
And that's different. So here's the paper. Should I drop it in Devo or organoids?
Organoids. I think probably maybe Devo as well. That might be
sure. Yeah. Sorry. There we go. And, yeah. There it is.
All right, so there it is. Yeah, I think I've seen this paper. Maybe it's even independently of the channel. But,
okay, good.
Yeah, so this is just inferring cell regulomes, inferring and perturbing cell-fate regulomes in human brain organoids.
And they have, the repository Quad Bio Lab, Quantitative Developmental Biology Lab.
Okay.
Is there here? I'll put this. Is there group? I mean, that's like the ETH group, even though a bunch of them seem to be at Roche.
Yeah.
But I see in this, so Pando is the multiome GRN inference.
Yeah.
And then they have, the nice thing about this paper is that they have, a data section and a code section, right?
Right.
The data availability, code availability.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
online
So
content.
yeah. So what's this kind of, it's like seq RNA.
RNA-seq.
Yeah, RNA-seq.
So
Yeah.
it looks like the way they define regulomes is multi-omics, but also transcriptional regulation. So you have multi-omics, which is just where, and the thing I have always amazed by is like they can always come up with a new omic. It's like, so you have like the transcriptomics, you have the regulome, I guess, which is the just the network, and
Yeah.
then of course some of the other things like some of the other ohms that are involved in that chromatin accessibility and things like that.
Yeah, proteomics.
Yeah, proteomics.
Yeah. And I assume that their choice of organoids is restricting the genomics that they're actually looking at, in the sense that like by using a particular cell line.
Yeah.
They're I'm not familiar with what the GLI3KO organoids. I would need to look that up in terms of what that.
It just might be easier to culture too. I mean, it's just
true. Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, we're almost getting to the point where we can start to. We're going to start with some projects with some open source bioreactors.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, and so at this point, I think what we're it's been a long time coming, right? I think at this point we're going to start with we're going to culture E. coli to produce growth factors that we would use for the organoids.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is an old. This was something that I think was like right before the pandemic. I seem to remember meeting in person. I don't know. It's all fuzzy now, right? But this was an old idea where it was like maybe we start with a little synthetic bio, just to again, some of this also getting to the point where we can. We're not quite what do they call it, BSL-2. I mean, in terms of biosafety, like we're still using some kind of shared facilities, lab space, and things like that. So we need to get our we're working there. We're working there. But that would be the next thing would be looking at like whether we would actually start with human cells or would we start with, say, mouse cells or something like that. And some of that has to do with just how good do you think you are at this point?
Oh well, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like magic trying to get certain cell types to grow. It's like
yeah. And I think about that. I think about that Madeline Lancaster talk in terms of just reproducibility is a big problem in organoid research.
Yeah.
In the top labs.
Right.
The labs that have everything, have protocols, have kind of do a lot of knowledge transfer by in the kind of not word of mouth, but like basically by apprenticeship. And so how valuable that is in terms of when you're talking about these very long manual protocols.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, what do you did you look at this because you thought that would be interesting in terms of this kind of cell fate regulomes?
I was just interested in the term regulome.
Okay.
And like getting because we're doing this paper that's coming out like probably this next week on the sort of the theory of differentiation waves. And to do that, we did Lucas and myself did a lengthy data analysis where we combined genomic data, proteomic data, methylomic data, and
Okay.
brought that together to say things about certain candidate genes and candidate proteins, and so it's kind of interesting how to combine the data sets that are available. So we have all sorts of data sets available from different types of ohms, and bringing those together. And they of course are doing like primary data collection, but just thinking about all the things that you need to make your argument, a
Yeah.
theoretical argument too,
Yeah.
to put all those things together. It's
Yeah.
so yeah, I
Yeah.
think that would be good for Lucas maybe to look at this paper and see how
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
doing things.
And I think, I mean, yeah, and I like it because of course it's organoid, and it would, it's exactly how you would imagine neurodevelopmental processes. I mean, it's just the kind of the base on which neurodevelopmental processes are kind of are running mechanistically, and you can imagine this is what we need to know to understand all the different ways that it could potentially veer off, or
Yeah.
um, yeah, that would be awesome. Plus, I think yeah, they're again one of these groups that I think is doing organoids research a little differently than some of the kind of brain science labs. Because I think they have a kind of drug function goal.
Yeah.
That yeah, it might be driven a little differently. Let's just say, like slightly different goals. Not necessarily better, but
Well, they have to understand regulation better for that.
I mean, yeah, it's really their questions are different than some of um, disease specific disease focused groups. But yeah, okay. Well, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't more involved today, but great papers as usual.
Yeah.
I've still got to figure out a way to scrape all our YouTube videos to get
Yeah, the Active Inference Institute has been doing some good work. Like they've been using AI to do this on their videos. Like I don't know like the details. I should ask more about that and people who are doing this. But like there, of course, YouTube has like they can chapterize things, but like there's a lot that you could do with the videos, just with like some AI tool. I mean, people are developing tools all the time now.
Yeah. That would be great to have chapters in terms of the papers you cover to yeah. Well, we could talk to Daniel and at least find out who's doing that. Who just came up on active inference? Josh Bungard. I posted that in. Yeah. You saw that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He did a good talk. He had like just like the whole menagerie of his embodied agents and talking about each one.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Now there was I think something else though that I thought. Well, I'm curious. I haven't gone through Patrick Minalt's talk yet.
Okay.
But I would expect that his foundation models for neuroscience would be a good talk.
Yeah.
Anyway, good deal.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for attending, and see you next week.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.